He was known as a man whose name traveled faster than his footsteps, whispered in closed rooms and spoken carefully in the open. Power followed him wherever he went, not because he demanded it loudly, but because it had been earned through years of ruthless decisions and unbreakable control. In his world, hesitation was weakness, compassion was a liability, and emotions were luxuries meant for people who could afford to be vulnerable. He had built an empire on silence and fear, shaping his life into something untouchable, distant, and cold from the outside. Everything about him represented success: tailored suits, guarded entrances, influence that reached beyond borders. Yet beneath the polished surface was a life stripped of warmth. His days were filled with orders, consequences, and constant vigilance. Trust had become foreign to him, and kindness something he viewed as a story told to children, not a rule for survival. Every choice he made was calculated, every step measured, as though his entire existence were a long negotiation with danger itself. Loneliness had crept into his life so gradually that he no longer recognized it as pain. It had simply become normal. Nights passed without comfort. Mornings began without purpose beyond maintaining control. The wealth around him could silence the world, but it could not fill the emptiness he carried. He had trained himself to believe that this emptiness was the price of power, a necessary trade to remain standing at the top. The past he came from was never spoken of, yet it lingered like a shadow that never left his side. A childhood shaped by absence had taught him early that the world offered no protection. Strength, he learned, had to be built alone. Mercy had never saved anyone he knew. Survival had. That belief hardened him over time, turning him into a man who believed hearts were meant to be guarded and never exposed. People did not look at him and see a human story. They saw a symbol of authority, a figure who commanded respect without asking for it. Fear followed him more faithfully than loyalty ever could. And he accepted that, even embraced it, because fear was predictable. It did not betray. It did not disappoint. Yet somewhere deep beneath the layers of discipline and dominance, something had quietly faded. Not broken, not destroyed, just buried. A part of him that once understood innocence, that once recognized vulnerability not as weakness but as truth. He believed that part of him was gone forever, lost to the years he spent becoming someone the world could not hurt. He had not realized that hearts do not disappear. They wait. At this point in his life, he believed change was no longer possible. Men like him did not transform. They endured until the end, ruled until they fell. Redemption was a word used by people who had the time and safety to reflect. He believed he had neither. His path seemed fixed, carved into stone by choices he could not undo. What he did not know was that the world was about to challenge everything he believed. Not through violence or power struggles, but through a quiet presence that would awaken something he had buried long ago. An encounter so small yet so profound that it would begin to shift the foundation of a man who thought his heart was beyond reach. This was the life he stood in, complete, powerful, and utterly empty just before everything changed. It happened away from the noise that usually surrounded his life, far from guarded doors and watchful eyes. The place was quiet enough that even his footsteps seemed out of place, as if the world itself had slowed down for a moment he had never planned for. He was not searching for anything, nor expecting meaning to find him there. Yet sometimes the most powerful changes begin when a person is least prepared. That was when he noticed the child, small and motionless, seated alone in a corner where no one seemed to look twice. The child did not cry or call for help, did not move with impatience or fear. There was a stillness about them that felt heavier than noise ever could. It was the kind of stillness born from waiting without certainty, without assurance that someone would come. First, he assumed what most people would. Poverty, perhaps. Neglect, maybe. In his world, abandoned people were not unusual. Cities were full of souls society had learned to ignore. He had ignored many himself. Normally, he would have passed by without pause, letting the moment disappear as countless others had before. But something about this child slowed him. The child's face was turned slightly upward, not toward any movement, not toward any sound, but into empty space. Their hands rested close to their body, fingers curled inward as if holding on to something invisible. There was no panic in the posture, only quiet endurance. That quiet unsettled him more than fear ever could. He stood there longer than he meant to. The child did not react to his presence, did not sense the powerful figure nearby. That absence of recognition struck him deeply. In his life, people always noticed him too quickly, too nervously. This child did not. To them, he was nothing more than air. For a man used to control, that invisibility felt strange. The surroundings suddenly felt different, smaller, more fragile. The power he carried meant nothing here. Money, influence, reputation, none of it mattered in the presence of a child so utterly alone. The world he ruled over seemed distant, irrelevant, almost meaningless in that moment. He became aware of how wrong the situation was. Children were meant to be protected, guided, surrounded by noise and warmth. This child had none of that. No adult presence, no sign of care, just patience learned far too early in life. Something inside him shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. A discomfort he could not ignore. He felt it in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome, yet impossible to push away. It was not pity. It was recognition, a silent acknowledgement of something he had once been, or perhaps something he had lost. For the first time in a very long time, he stayed without a reason tied to power or survival. He stayed because leaving suddenly felt wrong. The child remained unaware of the moment unfolding, unaware that someone capable of immense cruelty stood nearby, quietly affected in a way no threat or rival had ever managed. Fate had placed them in the same space without explanation, without warning, and in that quiet place, where nothing dramatic happened on the surface, something deep had already begun to change. This encounter, so ordinary to the outside world, marked the beginning of a crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime building, one he did not yet understand, but would soon be unable to ignore. At first, he tried to explain the situation with logic. Maybe the child was resting. Maybe someone had stepped away for only a moment. He told himself there had to be a simple reason for such loneliness. Yet the longer he stayed, the more those excuses faded under the weight of reality. Time passed, and nothing changed. The child did not move toward sound, did not turn when footsteps echoed nearby, did not react to the movements of the world passing around them. It was then that the truth began to reveal itself, not suddenly, but gently, painfully, layer by layer. The child was not ignoring the world. The child simply could not see it. That realization struck him far harder than he expected. Blindness was not just the absence of sight. It was a life shaped by trust and vulnerability. It meant depending on the kindness of a world that rarely noticed you. It meant learning stillness instead of curiosity, patience instead of play. And here was a child forced to carry that burden alone. He observed the small details that made denial impossible. The way the child's gaze never followed motion. The careful positioning of their hands, memorizing space instead of exploring it. The still expression that had learned disappointment so early it no longer protested. This was not a temporary situation. This was a pattern. The realization awakened something uncomfortable in him. He had grown up believing weakness was a choice, that survival belonged to the strong. But this child had never been given a chance to be strong. Life had simply taken something essential away and offered nothing in return. For the first time, he saw innocence not as an idea but as a living weight pressing against his chest. Memories surfaced without permission of cold rooms, of being unseen, of learning too young that no one was coming unless you forced them to. He had responded by becoming dangerous. This child had responded by becoming quiet. Two different paths born from the same abandonment. That contrast haunted him. The world suddenly felt unfair in a way he could not rationalize. He had built an empire from suffering, turned pain into power. And yet here was a life that had been given only loss, with no tools to transform it into anything else. He realized something else then, something even harder to accept. If he walked away, nothing would change. The child would still be there, alone, waiting, invisible. The world would keep moving, and this moment would disappear like countless others. And he would return to his life unchanged, untouched, protected by the lies he told himself. But now that he understood the truth, ignorance was no longer possible. The child's blindness was not just physical. It symbolized the way the world had turned its back, refusing to look at those who could not demand attention. And for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of responsibility, not forced, not negotiated, but chosen. That realization marked the point of no return, that he did not yet know what he would do. He only knew that the man who stood there now was no longer the same one who had arrived. Something inside him had shifted permanently, reshaped by the quiet truth of a child who had never once asked for help, and deep within him, a question began to take form, one that power, money, and fear could not silence. What kind of man walks away after seeing this? He had always believed decisions should be cold, calculated, and free of emotion. In his world, hesitation was weakness, and compassion was a liability others exploited without mercy. Every move he had ever made was designed to protect power, to strengthen control, to eliminate risk. This moment, however, refused to fit into any rule he had lived by. The decision formed slowly, almost against his will. It did not arrive as a dramatic vow or heroic impulse. Instead, it crept into his thoughts quietly, settling in places he usually kept guarded. The more he tried to push it away, the heavier it became. Walking away no longer felt like neutrality. It felt like participation in cruelty. That disturbed him deeply. He questioned himself with the same intensity he once reserved for enemies. Why should this child matter? Why now? Why him? There were countless suffering people in the world, countless lives broken beyond repair. He had built his empire in the shadow of those truths, convincing himself that survival demanded indifference. Yet this child had shattered that belief without force. The difference lay in vulnerability. This was not an adult shaped by choices and consequences. This was a life interrupted before it had truly begun. The child had not lost innocence through wrongdoing or rebellion, but through neglect and silence. And that purity made indifference impossible. He realized that power carried meaning only when it was used for something other than fear. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he could do instead of what he usually did. The reach of his influence suddenly appeared larger, not as a weapon but as a shield. It frightened him how easily he could change this child's fate and how often he had chosen not to do so for others. The decision frightened him because it came from a place he had buried long ago. He understood that once he intervened, there would be no undoing it. Mercy, once extended, had consequences. It would invite scrutiny, attachment, and accountability. And attachment was dangerous. It created openings, softened edges, and blurred lines he had spent years sharpening. Still, he chose it. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. This choice went against everything he was known for, against his reputation, against the identity he had constructed piece by piece. Yet something deeper than reputation demanded action now. Something human, something honest. By choosing to step in, he unknowingly set events into motion that would reach far beyond this moment. A single act of compassion would ripple into parts of his life he believed were untouchable, challenging loyalties, exposing secrets, and forcing him to confront the cost of the man he had become. He did not yet see how much this decision would change him. He only knew that for the first time in his life, power was being used not to dominate, but to protect. And that realization carried a weight heavier than any threat he had ever faced. This was the moment his heart quietly rebelled against the empire he had built, and he allowed it. Once the decision was made, it did not explode into action the way violence usually did in his life. There was no rush, no display of dominance, no need to assert control. Instead, his movements became measured, careful, almost restrained, as if the presence of the child demanded a different version of him, one that understood fragility. Protection, he realized, was not always loud. The child remained unaware of the shift occurring around them, unaware that someone had silently assumed responsibility for a life that was not his. That innocence carried weight. It reminded him that true safety meant allowing someone to remain unaware of danger in the first place. For once, the goal was not fear, but calmed, he became conscious of everything that could threaten this fragile existence. The coldness of the world, the indifference of strangers, the countless dangers that lurked unnoticed. Things he had long accepted as normal suddenly felt unacceptable. The environment no longer appeared neutral. It felt hostile. And that changed him. This was not a transaction. There was no gain to be calculated, no reputation to be enhanced. Helping this child would bring complications, questions, and risks. Yet the absence of reward made the act purer than anything he had done before. It was protection stripped of ego. He recognized how unfamiliar this role felt. In his world, protection usually meant ownership. People were shielded because they belonged to him, because their safety strengthened his position. This was different. The child belonged to no one, least of all him. And yet the urge to protect was stronger precisely because there was no claim attached. That realization softened something rigid inside him. He adjusted his presence instinctively, minimizing the threat he might pose. He became quieter, more aware, more patient. It was unsettling to discover how naturally this version of himself emerged when cruelty was no longer required. For the first time, he considered what it meant to be strong without being feared. This small act, this silent commitment, marked the beginning of a bond built not on words, but on intention. The child did not need to see protection to receive it. The world simply needed to become less dangerous than it had been moments before. And so he stood between the child and the chaos of life, not as a ruler or enforcer, but as a presence that refused to leave. That choice reshaped him more than he understood. Because once protection is given freely, it changes both the one who receives it and the one who offers it. And deep within him, a truth began to take root, one that would continue to grow with every step forward. Saving this child would not only alter their fate, it would slowly, relentlessly, save his. What followed did not feel like something new being created, but rather something long forgotten being rediscovered. The connection that formed between them did not rely on sight, speech, or explanation. It existed in awareness, in presence, in the simple fact that someone stayed when the world usually moved on. The child sensed change before understanding it. There was a shift in the air, a difference in how the world felt around them. Not louder, not brighter, just steadier. The child's body relaxed in small, almost invisible ways, the kind of adjustments made by someone who had learned to read safety through instinct rather than reassurance. This sensitivity revealed how rarely safety had existed before. That realization unsettled him. He understood then that consistency mattered more than promises. Words could be misunderstood or broken, but remaining present communicated something far deeper. For the first time, he practiced patience without expecting control in return. It was not restraint forced by strategy, but restraint born from care. He began noticing details he would once have dismissed. The rhythm of the child's breathing, the pauses between movements, the careful way the child navigated stillness. These observations did not feel intrusive. They felt protective. Awareness became a form of guarding. In silence, trust took shape. The child did not flinch or withdraw. That alone spoke volumes. It suggested that despite everything taken from them, the ability to sense intent remained intact. Trust was not given easily, it was allowed gradually. And that slow acceptance carried a weight that humbled him. He realized how different this bond was from every alliance he had ever formed. There was no exchange of power, no loyalty demanded, no fear reinforcing obedience. The connection existed purely because both lives now occupied the same moment with shared purpose. And that terrified him in a quiet way. Because bonds without leverage cannot be controlled. They cannot be threatened into obedience or bought into silence. They demand honesty, consistency, and accountability, qualities he had avoided most of his life. Yet he did not pull away. Instead, he allowed the bond to deepen, accepting vulnerability where dominance once ruled. With each passing moment, the wall between who he was and who he might become grew thinner. The child unknowingly held a mirror to his soul, reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized but deeply respected. He felt something unfamiliar settle inside his chest, not urgency, not fear, but responsibility, not imposed, chosen. This wordless bond altered his understanding of strength. He saw that true authority was not about command, but about care. Not about being followed, but about being trusted. And once that trust existed, even in its simplest form, it became something sacred without a single word spoken. A promise had been made. A promise not written in law or blood, but in presence. And for the first time in his life, that promise felt heavier and more meaningful than any oath he had ever sworn. Change never happens in isolation. The moment he stepped even slightly outside the role the world expected of him, resistance followed. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in the form of unease. The balance he had maintained for years started to tremble, as if the world sensed his shift and responded with pressure. Responsibility came with consequences. The life he had built thrived on predictability, on fear, obedience, and distance. Compassion disrupted that structure. Protecting the child introduced an element he could not fully control, and the systems around him reacted accordingly. What had once felt solid now demanded constant awareness. That he became more cautious, not because he feared losing power, but because the cost of a mistake had changed. Risk was no longer abstract. It had a human weight attached to it, fragile and innocent, dependent on his choices in a way no one ever had been before. This awareness reshaped his instincts. Where once he had acted decisively without hesitation, he now paused. Each decision carried a ripple effect he had never considered. Enemies remained enemies, danger still existed, but now there was something precious standing in the path of that chaos. The world was no longer a battlefield. It was a place filled with potential harm that needed to be navigated carefully, pressure built from all sides. His absence from certain routines did not go unnoticed. Patterns shifted. Questions formed. The world that once obeyed without curiosity now sensed change. He felt the strain of maintaining two versions of himself, the man the world knew and the man this child was slowly bringing to the surface. That tension exhausted him. Yet even as the pressure increased, he did not regret the choice he had made. If anything, the resistance clarified the truth. This path was difficult precisely because it mattered. The challenge confirmed the value of what he was protecting, that he realized that kindness carried its own form of courage. Standing against enemies had always been easy. Standing against expectation was far harder. He was now defying not just others, but the identity he had carefully constructed over a lifetime. That internal conflict weighed heavier than any external threat. Still, he persisted, because every time doubt surfaced, he remembered the quiet trust placed in him. A trust unspoken, yet absolute. The world could push back all it wanted. He had already crossed the point of no return. This struggle marked the beginning of transformation under pressure. Not a sudden redemption, but a slow, deliberate reshaping forged through resistance. The more the world tested him, the more determined he became to hold his ground, not out of pride, but out of responsibility. And in facing that resistance, he learned something crucial. Protecting innocence was the most dangerous act he had ever committed. That as the pressure around him intensified, it became impossible to move forward without looking back. The child's presence did not simply change his future, it dragged his past into the light, exposing memories he had buried beneath years of control and cruelty. What he had spent a lifetime running from now followed him in silence. He began to remember things he had taught himself to forget. Moments of hunger masked as strength. Nights spent learning self-reliance because no one else would offer it. The early understanding that compassion was unreliable and mercy came with conditions. He had survived by hardening himself, by stripping away softness until only survival remained. That version of him had succeeded, but at a cost he had never calculated. The child became a living reminder of that cost. In protecting someone who had no defenses, he was forced to acknowledge the child he once was, the one who never received protection, who learned to endure instead of hope. That recognition was painful. It cracked open wounds he had sealed with ambition and violence. Wounds he had pretended no longer existed. Guilt surfaced quietly but persistently. He questioned how many lives he had ignored along the way, how many moments like this one he had walked past without consequence. Power had shielded him from accountability, allowing him to believe that morality was flexible. Now that belief felt hollow. The child's innocence made every past justification feel smaller, thinner, easier to tear apart. For the first time, he allowed regret to exist without drowning it in denial. This internal confrontation was more dangerous than any enemy he had faced. It required honesty without armor, reflection without control. He could not intimidate his memories into silence. He could not negotiate with the truth. He could only endure it. And so he did. He accepted that his past could not be erased, but it could be answered. The harm he had caused could not be undone, but it could be balanced by what he chose to protect now. This realization did not absolve him, it challenged him to be better, to use his power not as a shield for guilt, but as a tool for change. The child did not know any of this, And that was the point. Redemption did not require recognition. It required commitment. Quiet, consistent, unwavering. He began to understand that real atonement was not dramatic or visible. It was measured in restraint, in protection, in choosing mercy when cruelty would be easier. Facing his past reshaped his understanding of the future. He no longer saw strength as domination, but as endurance with purpose. He no longer saw fear as useful, but as something that corrodes everything it touches. And slowly, the man he had been began to loosen his grip on the man he was becoming. This confrontation did not weaken him. It refined him. Because only someone brave enough to face their past can truly change what lies ahead. Why now? The path ahead no longer felt optional. What had begun as an instinctive act of protection had transformed into a conscious direction, one that demanded consistency rather than impulse. He understood that a single good decision meant nothing if it was not followed by others just as deliberate. Change, he realized, was not a moment, it was a practice. For the first time, he began shaping his future with intention rather than reaction. The world he ruled over was built on fear and inevitability. People believed he would always choose the harshest option, always prioritize dominance over mercy. That belief had kept him powerful, but it also kept him trapped. Now, with the child's fragile future tied to his own choices, that old path felt dangerously limited. He began imagining a life structured around protection instead of control. This vision unsettled him because it required long-term thinking without violence as the foundation. It meant investing in stability rather than chaos, in prevention rather than punishment. These ideas had once felt weak to him. Now they felt necessary. He understood that the child's future would be shaped by consistency, not fear. Safety would need to be reliable, not conditional. Growth would require patience, opportunity, and care, things that could not be forced or rushed. And if he failed, the damage would not be measured in lost power, but in a broken life. That responsibility grounded him. He began taking steps that reflected this shift, not loudly or publicly, but carefully. Every adjustment was made with the awareness that someone vulnerable depended on him remaining disciplined and present. Recklessness was no longer thrilling. It was unacceptable. The man he had been would have laughed at such restraint. But that man no longer held complete control. He realized that choosing a different future meant accepting limits not imposed by enemies, but chosen for the sake of someone else. These limits felt strange at first, like chains, until he understood they were anchors. They kept him steady, focused, human. This new future did not erase danger. Threats still existed, and the world remained unforgiving. But now his actions were guided by purpose instead of habit. Every choice answered a single quiet question. Does this protect what matters? And slowly, that question reshaped everything. He was no longer driven by how feared he was, but by how safe the child would be tomorrow and the day after that. That future mattered more than reputation, more than legacy, more than the empire he had built. In choosing this path, he accepted that transformation came with cost. But for the first time in his life, the cost felt worth paying. Because a future chosen for someone else carries a meaning far greater than one built only for power. What ultimately changed him was not the danger he faced, nor the sacrifices he made, but the permanence of what had settled inside him. The child did not simply alter his choices. They rewrote the way he understood himself. The hardness that had once defined him no longer felt permanent. It felt like something he had worn for survival, not something he was meant to keep. He accepted that some transformations cannot be undone. The child's presence became a constant reminder that strength without compassion is hollow, and power without purpose is fragile. Every decision he made now carried an invisible measure not of gain, but of impact. He no longer asked how far his reach extended, but how safely it could shelter someone who depended on him. This shift did not erase his past. He remained accountable to the life he had lived, the harm he had caused, and the darkness he had once commanded. But those truths no longer defined his future. Instead of running from them, he carried them forward as reminders of what must never be repeated. The child grew safer, steadier, protected by something stronger than fear, consistency. And in providing that stability, he found his own reflection changing. He became more patient, more deliberate, less reactive. The chaos he once thrived in slowly lost its grip on him. What surprised him most was peace. Not the absence of danger, but the absence of inner conflict. For the first time, his actions aligned with something deeper than ambition. He was no longer divided between survival and conscience. They had finally learned to coexist. The heart he thought was long dead proved resilient. It had waited beneath years of armor, bruised but intact, ready to respond the moment it was given a reason. The child had not healed him through effort or understanding, but simply by existing, by needing nothing more than safety and care. In giving that, he reclaimed something essential. His legacy was no longer measured in fear or control, but in a life protected, a future preserved. That realization outlived every title he had ever earned. It followed him quietly, steadily, shaping each day that came after. Some changes announce themselves loudly. Others unfold in silence and last forever. This was the latter. A man once ruled by darkness had found light not through redemption earned, but through responsibility accepted. And though the world might never know the full story, he would carry its truth within him for the rest of his life. Because saving one innocent life had not just changed a child's future, it had given him his own.